Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson about the age of exploration, or as some like to call it, the age of exploitation. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So we are starting our AP United States History extravaganza with period 1, and that is the roughly the years from 1491 to 1607. And so without further ado, let's move on with life, right? Let's keep on keeping on. Okay, so these are the key topics we're going to be talking about today. So Native American culture before Europe took their stuff, a new world, the West African connection, which a lot of people think West Africa, what does that have to do with United States history? But for those of you who are aware of the slave trade, it has quite a bit to do with it. Europe, right before they came over here and trashed the place, the European concept of the New World. The French, who don't matter all that much for U.S. history, but they matter just teensy bits. We'll touch on them. The English, very, very important. And Roanoke, the colony that thought it could but couldn't. And in a subsequent video lesson, I will speak about specific details about Native American tribes. I do want to, at this time, issue a disclaimer. This is a survey course, so there's plenty of information that I'm going to, out of necessity, have to leave out. So this is not a hugely comprehensive course, right? We're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details of everything, but I am going to cover as much as I can the big ticket items and guide you on this path through U.S. history. So let's keep going. Okay, Native American culture before Europe took their stuff, because let's be real, in fact, they did take their stuff. So the Native American economies were agrarian, right? They operated on a barter system or on a more of a collectivist sort of mindset. It wasn't yours and mine, it was ours. And when you're dealing with smaller tribes that have very unique and particular cultural constructs that everybody in the tribe for the most part agrees on, you're able to do this. This was, in point of fact, not the system that Europeans have been engaging in. Although everybody thinks at this point that capitalism was the economic system. No, capitalism doesn't show up on the human radar until 1776 with Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations. Prior to that, the economic system that was in play was called mercantilism or mercantilism. And we will talk about that in much greater detail in later video lessons. So, something important to note in Mexico and pretty much all of Central America, the Aztec were the dominant empire. I don't even say tribe because they were not just a tribe, they were an empire. They controlled the whole thing. Now, why does this matter for the purposes of U.S. history? The Aztec were not in what is now considered the United States of America. Well, the Aztec, because they had conquered everybody else, when the Europeans came in, all they had to do was conquer the Aztec. This made European colonization much faster and much easier, thus enabling European colonists to migrate themselves into what is now considered the United States. They achieved that at a faster clip. So knowing that the Aztec were the dominant empire and that it was easier to take over one than like a lot more than one, that's pertinent. So languages, dialects, and cultures, right? So languages vary, like you have Spanish versus English, right? Well, there were just a myriad of different languages that Native Americans spoke. So you can't just say, oh, it was this language. There were hundreds of them, and some thousands of them. Dialects within languages varied, right? So, and I have an example there, Spanish in Spain versus Spanish in Mexico. Any Spanish speaker knows that depending on which country you're coming from, it's going to vary the dialect. It's going to shift it a bit, right? And also, cultures and identities varied, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is something I want you to pay attention to. This concept down here of gender reciprocity, right? Now, say it with me. Europeans were all about the patriarchy, right? So, and of course, right now we're fighting the patriarchy. But see, a lot of Native American cultures, not all of them, but a lot of them did not have patriarchy. Like this concept of patriarchy was very alien to them. They were like, what are you talking about? Because in gender reciprocity, men and women were equally important. And in times of trial and in times of strife, in times of conflict, the genders could switch roles, right? Women could take up arms and men could stay home and take care of the kids and cook and feed the family, right? So there wasn't this sort of hard and fast, like, oh, women only do this and men only do that, like there was in Europe. It was very clearly delineated in Europe, like this is women over here and men over here and that's it. That's it. That wasn't how it operated in many Native American tribes. And so I want you to just contemplate for just a second why European men in particular would have been threatened by this idea that women could, do things just as well, if not better than them. Just contemplate why that might have posed a problem for them. Okay, so a new world. Now listen, natives were decent people by and large, right? And not all tribes were warrior tribes. Some were, but not all were. Many of them were just peaceful folks just trying to, do their thing, right? So what did they want? They wanted peaceful trade. What did they get, ladies and gentlemen? They got smallpox. Okay, they wanted peaceful trade and they got smallpox. How did this happen? Well, European settlers came in there, took their land, eradicated as Native American cultures as possible because they wanted to make room for colonies. Now, something to note, a lot of people assume that the New World was conquered by conquest, as in military extravaganzas. Not so. There was plenty of that. Don't get me wrong, there was plenty of that. But the vast majority of Native Americans were wiped out by disease. European diseases that they would never been exposed to and therefore had no immunity. So that's something to keep in mind. Columbian Exchange. This is a key idea. The next couple of slides are going to talk about this, but I want you to be aware that Europe got way more out of the European exchange. I'm sorry, of the Columbian, I guess you could call it a European exchange, right? Because they got most of it. But they got way more out of it than the natives did, than those in the New World did. Now, what was it? It was a biological and cultural exchange between the Old and the New Worlds, okay? Biological, cultural exchange between Old and New Worlds. So here's a graphic, a visual representation of this exchange. So now, some of the things that I like to point out, those of you who know me know that I love me some coffee. So one nice thing that came to the New World was coffee. Coffee wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Columbian Exchange. But chocolate already existed in the New World, so chocolate then got sent over to the Old World. So now, ladies and gentlemen, you have coffee and you have chocolate existing on the same continents. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a beautiful thing and reason enough to celebrate, right? But all kidding aside, look at these diseases. I mean, there's a whopping list there that we're looking at that came from Europe over to the Americas, okay? And it was disastrous. Here's another graphic just to give you another visual representation. It's a little less detailed, but it accomplishes pretty much the same goal. But here it's a little bit more specific. You have Old World in Africa and then the New World here. Coincidentally, these three things represent the 3 points on the triangle of triangular trade, but we'll get to that in a minute. And here's yet another graphic. Now, I always like to point out on this slide that the Europeans deserved this. They got themselves some syphilis, right? Now, syphilis, for those of you who are unaware, is a sexually transmitted infection. So, go ahead. European men, enjoy that. You've earned every bit of it, right? Because there was a lot of unsavory activities that were taking place in the New World. So they deserve that. So I like to point out that at least we were able to get one little kick in there into those Europeans coming in, and that kick in the gut was syphilis. So triangular trade. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a super huge amount of time talking about this now because we're going to get into big detail about this in our next unit, colonization. So I do want to mention it, though, because it is very, very important. Foundational concept in U.S. history. So as I said before, triangular trade, it's a triangle, right? So it's otherwise known sometimes as the transatlantic trade. And what we're really talking about here is the slave trade. That's really what we're talking about here. Okay, so you have the 3 points of the triangle. You have Europe, you have the New World, and you have Africa, right? So those are the 3 points, right? So thousands of slaves were brought over to work on plantations, and this is an interesting fact here. Between the years of 1650 and 1831, more slaves than Europeans actually came to the New World. Now, the Europeans would have been happy to use the existing labor force. However, because disease wiped out the Native Americans, they were unable to use that existing labor force. And in order to make the money they wanted to make through plantations and cash crops and just massive agriculture, they needed a huge labor force. So they imported that labor force from Africa. Now, this last bullet, I do not bring this up in any way to justify or excuse the slave trade. That is not the purpose of bringing up that fact. It simply helps us to understand the context and know how and why certain things happen. So if you don't understand that Europeans could not get into the interior of Africa during this period in history, you won't understand the importance of imperialism when it happens later in the 19th century or the 1800s. So Europeans did in fact buy the slaves, and they created a market for that because they were in demand. But because Europeans didn't go into Africa at this point and just take people. They couldn't. They would have if they could. And they tried, but they died trying. They couldn't get into the interior for a number of reasons. They couldn't navigate the terrain. Malaria and other diseases were wiping them out. So what would typically happen is African tribes that were warring with each other, the victor, the winner, would take the survivors of the defeated tribe, and they would sell the members of that defeated tribe to the Europeans. So like it says here, it's usually captives of rival tribes. So that is how the slave trade really kicked off. But again, the Europeans are going to double down and expand it to the best of their ability. So I just want to put that out there. Okay, the Renaissance, right? I talked just a teensy bit about the Renaissance in a previous video lesson, Causes and Effects of the Age of Exploration. If you haven't watched it yet, then you shouldn't be watching this. You should watch that one first and then come and watch this one because, order, right? Chronology, good times. So you should pause, stop this video, and go back to the other one if you haven't watched it. Okay, so the Renaissance, major period in European history. It's known as the rebirth. Basically, this is Europe rebuilding itself after the disaster that was the Black Death, okay? And there was a huge, massive explosion of knowledge and learning, interest in science, interest in the classics of philosophy and just different thought processes. And this development of a natural curiosity about our world that allowed the scientific revolution to come and happen after it, as it would roughly a century later. But during the Renaissance, this thing was invented. My man Johannes Gutenberg, invented the printing press. The printing press is huge. It's absolutely colossal. It had a similar effect on European society as the internet has had on our modern world, which is to say, just exponential. You almost can't quantify how large of an impact it had. With the printing press, all of a sudden, you could print books, make them cheaper, make them easier to get, and more numerous, thus allowing more people to access knowledge. Knowledge was no longer under the complete control of the nobility and of the clergy, right? So now people were actually able to learn stuff. And as they learned stuff, they started questioning things that never were questioned before, like, why am I listening to this noble? Like, why is this noble better than me? Maybe we should have a different system of government than a bunch of different, noblemen who are running around trying to kill each other. Maybe there's a better way to exist. Thus, enter the centralization of political authority. This is the development of the modern nation state, ladies and gentlemen. So instead of having a bunch of nobles warring about just very loose control over their territories, you now have these everybody centralized under one banner, under a strong king. And this allowed for a centralization of resources. Without centralization of resources, you don't get colonization, you don't get exploration, none of that happens. So whether you're on board with with this, age of exploration or not, that's immaterial. It happened, right? So we want to understand how and why it happened, and one of the major causes for it was this development of the modern nation state. Now, at this point, I want to introduce you to a very important idea. Spain and England are not friends. They are also going to be the two preeminent colonial powers duking it out for control in the New World. So it's important that we lay that down right now. Okay, so the Europeans are in the New World, right? But who was there? Who are these people? Well, first of all, it was the Spanish that really started this show. The Portuguese were involved as well in South America. We'll get to that in a second. But the 16th century was the Spanish century, right? They really were just wiping the floor with all the competition, and they were the primary European power engaging in this exploration and exploitation. So who was doing this on behalf of the Spanish crown? These conquistadors. These conquistadors, you really need to know about these guys. Now, basically, these are the Spanish conquerors is who they were. Now, their official motto was God, glory, and gold, but their actual motto was gold, gold, glory. Maybe just a teensy bit of God to keep up appearances, right? They'll use religion to their advantage, but they really weren't caring much about that. They wanted gold. They wanted riches. They wanted to enrich themselves. That's what they wanted. Now, they were so violent and such a disaster that they were actually causing more problems than they were solving. So in an attempt to control these conquistadors, the Spanish crown implemented the encomienda system. Basically, Spanish monarchs said, listen, guys, if you just chill, if you just cool your jets and take a little bit more specific direction from us, we'll give you lands and titles in Europe and in the New World. But if you don't, you're going to lose it all. So you won't have anything in Spain. So just try to work with us. This worked to an extent. It's debatable how well it worked. We'll talk about this later, but just introduce the idea to you. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas was important. That was in 1494. Because it kept Spain and Portugal out of war. Basically, it divided the New World in a vertical line, right? So everything to one side of the line, to the right of the line was Portuguese, and everything to the left of the line was Spanish. So this is why Brazil speaks Portuguese, because Brazil was on the other side of that line, and Portuguese got that via the Treaty of Tordesillas. Okay, so here's a map. I want you to stare at this map and pause the video, and I want you to write down 3 pieces of information that you can pull from this video. All right, from this map. One of the things you're going to have to explore on the AP exam and also in the class generally is looking at visuals like this and trying to, this is considered a primary source. You can pull information from it and use it in an essay and use it to understand the era. So, pause the video, 3 facts you can pull from this that will help you understand this era. All right, Hernan Cortez. Now, when you picture conquistador, when you see the word, conquistador in the dictionary, Hernan Cortez is right next to it. All right, right next to it. He was not a very nice guy, but he was the poster boy. He was Spanish, he was Catholic, he was greedy, and he was ambitious, right? He's the one who took out the Aztec leader, and as I said before, they pretty much took out everybody else. So now Spain's Catholic and England is Protestant. The religious wars of Europe are going to follow and take place to some extent in the New World. So this is an important idea to know, that this was not just a nationhood conflict, this was a religious conflict. And whenever you bring religion into the mix of a conflict, it's going to make it more violent, it's going to make it more bloody, and it's going to make it more complicated. All right, so the French. This is really all we need to know about the French. So that's why people in Canada speak French. In the province of Quebec, for example, the French got Canada in the colonial wars, initially anyway. We'll get to that later. The French government was actually terrible to the colonies. They were such terrible managers that they basically broke the capacity for their colonies to grow economically, and that caused a lot of them to collapse. And this is going to cause significant problems for them later on. But again, that's not our problem. Basically, the big reason the French matter is because they had the territory of Louisiana. We buy the Louisiana Purchase from them in 1803, and that doubles the size of the United States territory. But we'll talk more about that when we get to that unit. All right, so the English, huge. Okay, let's talk about the English. This is big stuff. So Protestant Reformation, that came right at the end of the Renaissance and kind of started a new era, because during the Renaissance, people started questioning the Catholic Church. And a natural outgrowth of this was a whole separate development of a different kind of Christianity, and that was Protestantism. So the Protestant Reformation was a direct challenge on the Catholic Church. And what it caused was actually religion to be a much more democratic affair. Okay, for the purposes of the United States, you have tons of different Protestant denominations that come over to the New World because they couldn't practice freely in Europe, so they came over here to establish themselves and be able to practice and develop their own religions. So the Protestant Reformation has huge implications for the settlement and development of what will become the United States. Calvinism is going to play a huge role. The Pilgrims, Calvinists. Yes, Calvinists. They aren't just any Christians, they were Calvinists. This is going to be important. I'll talk more about Calvinism in a later video lesson when I talk about the Pilgrims, but that's going to play a big role. Oh, Elizabeth I. Okay, so I have some favorite monarchs. Topping this list is Elizabeth I. This woman was hardcore. She was the second female queen of Great Britain, and she was not nuts. Her sister, Bloody Mary, and they called her Bloody Mary for a reason. She killed tons of people in her executions for heresy, but she was absolutely nuts. Mary Tudor was just yeah, I can't say that. She was completely nuts, like out of her mind. So Elizabeth I took the throne after her sister died, right? So, you have the first woman who was a disaster. And in a patriarchal society where people think that women can't really do anything, and so now you got to come in as a woman and take over after your crazy sister, that's a tall order. So Elizabeth I was a genius with PR, like an absolute genius. So she went on Progress. She went all over England and actually made herself visible to her subjects. No monarch did this. She wanted them to see her so they could know her and therefore love her, right? She had a painting of herself, a portrait of herself put in every tavern in England so everyone could see her and again, therefore know her, right? She also framed herself as the Virgin Queen. She never married, because if she married, that could have potentially kicked off another civil war in England for which family was actually entitled to the throne. So she never married. She's the Virgin Queen. She's married or the mother of her subjects. So at the same time as she's ruling a country, she's fulfilling the traditional female role of mother, wife. Right? So she like played these cards absolutely perfectly, so deftly. It was genius. The other thing she did, because we got to when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, we got to talk just a little bit about what the Tudors did to England. So Henry VIII, I don't know if you guys have heard of Henry VIII, but Henry VIII got around and he really liked women a lot. He had several different wives. When he wanted to get divorced from his first wife, who was Catholic, the Pope wouldn't grant it to him. So he said, fine, I'll just form my own religion like the Protestants are doing, and I'll be the head of it, and I'll grant my own dang divorce, which is what he did. But he kept everything else Catholic. He just changed a couple little things, made himself head of the church, basically, right? So he goes through all of his wives. After he dies, his son, Edward, takes the throne. He is uber Protestant. Uber Protestant. So he takes the entire country so far Protestant. He's persecuting Catholics. He's killing them off, kicking them out of the country. He doesn't reign for that long because he was a sick kid and he died of tuberculosis at 16. He only reigned for a few years. In walks Bloody Mary Tudor, who is like psycho-Catholic, right? She's psycho about it. So she kicks out all the Protestants, okay, and starts killing off those who don't leave and makes everybody uber Catholic. We're more Catholic than Henry was now, right? And then she dies and Elizabeth takes the throne and says, so for the love of all things sacred, I got to find a way to fix this. So she says, Catholics can practice, but they have to pay a tax. And we're going to be Protestant, but we're not going to be psycho-Protestant, right? And so she unites the entire country under one Protestant banner, settling the religious question. And by stabilizing England in both politics, religion, and economics, she also fixed the currency that her father messed up. She makes colonization possible. So that we need to know that about this era during the Age of Exploration. Okay, Roanoke. We're almost done, folks. The colony that thought it could, but couldn't. There were actually two Roanokes, right? So the first one was in 1584. They hung out. Colonists never got the supplies they expected, so they said, forget this. They got back in their ships. They went back to England. They said, forget it. We're done. The second one was in 1587, and now you also have to keep in mind that England was fighting a war with Spain for those 3 years, so the colonists shipped out, went to Roanoke, and they were expecting supplies to come from Roanoke, supplies that never came. No ships went to Roanoke because England and Spain are in the middle of the war. When people did finally make it to Roanoke after the war, there were no more colonists. And nobody really knows what happened to them. There are theories. We've adjusted and found out some more information through archaeology and whatnot. And we have a lot of reasonable theories as to what happened to them, but nobody really knows for sure. When they got there, nobody was there. And that was England's first experiment in colonization, and it was a failure. These are the key terms to remember. You should pause the video, write all these things down. We're going to need to know those items. Questions? Feel free to research on your own. Ask me in class. This is the end of our video. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time.